As you know, since February 24th, there has been a war going on in Ukraine. There's been a lot of debate about who is at fault about the situation where we find ourselves in. I was sort of surprised to read that John Mearsheimer, one of the most famous realists, John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, he argued that Ukraine is the West's fault, basically. So I was wondering where you land on this. Obviously, Vladimir Putin started this war, but how did we get to this point?
Well, we got to this point over a long period. With regard to who is for blame to the war, there should be no question. It's Russian invasion of Ukraine, criminal invasion. You can give explanations for it, but there's no justification for it. So I don't think the question of blame arises. However, if you look at the background, there's plenty. We can go back 30 years when leading, there was a firm promise, explicit, unambiguous promise by the United States and by Germany and by the Secretary General of NATO. All of them said, we guarantee that NATO forces will not extend beyond Germany. It was very explicit, no ambiguity. It was sustained by President Bush. He kept to it. Bill Clinton started to waver. He was, on the one hand, telling Eastern European voting constituencies in the United States, like the Polish community, don't worry, we'll get you into NATO. On the other hand, he was saying very explicitly to the Russians, don't worry, we'll never move to NATO. You got protests from Yeltsin, Gorbachev, other Russian leaders. Finally, in 1997, he just ignored it and moved to bring in several, Poland, Hungary, Slovenia. He was strongly warned by a host of high US officials, including very famous ones like George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, Jack Matlock, Reagan's ambassador to Russia, leading Russia specialist, head of the CIA, director of the CIA, current director, preceding director, a whole host of officials, that this is very provocative, dangerous, and it could bring severe dangers. Well, he continued. George W. Bush, the next president, he carried it further. More warnings from US officials, protests from the Russians. The Russians also established very explicit red lines. We'll tolerate a lot of things, but not Georgia, not Ukraine. That's our geostrategic heartland, and no NATO membership. That was well understood on all sides. In 2014, at the time of the Maidan uprising, NATO began, there were several reactions. One is that Russia annexed Crimea and supported, moved in unofficially to the Donbas region, mostly Russian-oriented area. Meanwhile, NATO began providing weapons and training to Ukraine. This is already building up to a conflict, as one can see. In September, last September, September 2021, the United States came out with a strong policy statement saying that the door is wide open to Ukraine to join NATO as part of the enhanced preparation program for joining NATO. The US will provide heavy arms, joint military operations, training to Ukraine. that was strengthened in a November charter, official charter of policy with Ukraine. A couple months later, Russia invaded. So there's a big build-up to the story. Nothing justifies the invasion, but you can see the steps that provoked it, basically.
This leads me to the question of how does one not engage in being an apologist for Vladimir Putin, but still criticize actions done by NATO and by the West?
It's quite straightforward, exactly the way that I just did. The invasion is a criminal act. It's on a par with the US invasion of Iraq, Hitler-Stalin invasion of Poland, other cases of criminal aggression. On the other hand, you can also see the reasons for it. There's no contradiction.
European countries such as Finland and Sweden are now discussing whether they should join NATO, and it looks like they might actually do it within months or even years, but even that will be quick. Do you think it is a good thing that more European countries are thinking about joining NATO now?
I think that's Putin's gift to the United States. In the aggression was a criminal act. It was also a very stupid act. What he did was give the United States its fondest wish. There's a long issue, goes back right through the whole Cold War period, as to whether Europe will move on an independent course, become what used to be called a third force, maybe along the lines outlined by de Gaulle, later by Gorbachev when the Soviet Union collapsed, calling for what they called a common European home with no military alliances. There are good, certainly commercial, trade, security reasons why this would be beneficial to all. The Russians did make various offers in that direction. So did the United States pre-Clinton. So in the early 90s, the United States did initiate a program called Partnership for Peace, which it didn't eliminate NATO, but it sort of sidelined it. You could be a member of the Partnership for Peace without being a member of NATO. So Tajikistan, for example, was a member. Russia was interested. They moved repeatedly towards trying to join somehow with Western Europe, with Europe. That continued. So in 27, the year 27, Putin made an important speech in Munich, which was quite conciliatory and constructive. Various ideas about how they could cooperate was ignored. On top of this, I should say that the United States was carrying out actions with NATO that directly threatened Russian interests, was also doing it in a way which purposely humiliated Russia. The assumption was Russia's defeated, we can do anything we like. So the bombing of Serbia in 1999, Serbia was a Russian ally, wasn't even informed, just bombed Serbia. There was a pretext, for totally fraudulent pretext. The pretext was that NATO was intervening to stop atrocities. That was an outright lie. The atrocities were the consequence of the bombing and the anticipated and predicted consequence. We have definitive evidence of that. Kosovo was saturated with OSCE observers. They were giving regular reports. We know exactly what happened. But there's been massive lying about it, inverting the chronology. It was another case of straight aggression. The bombing of Libya was a direct attack on the Russians. the United States, it was mainly France and England, and the United States joined. They succeeded in passing a UN Security Council resolution calling for a no-fly zone. Russia agreed not to veto it with the promise from NATO that they would not do anything beyond enforcing the no-fly zone. They immediately violated that and became essentially the air force of the rebels, tore the country to shreds. Invasion of Iraq, of course, was an unprovoked criminal aggression threatening to Russia. But the Russian concerns were simply disregarded. They lost, they're finished, they're weak, we can do what we like. Well, finally, it got to the point where it reached the red lines, Georgia. Russia did react strongly. Then comes Ukraine. Now what about joining NATO? Let's go back to what has been the main issue right through the Cold War. Should Europe become an independent third force in a European common home, from the Atlantic to the Urals and de Gaulle's formulation, Gorbachev's formulation from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances? That's been the issue. The United States, of course, wanted the NATO Atlanticist version where it's in control. Putin solved the problem by giving the United States the greatest wish it could want: Europe totally under its control. Now, what about Finland and Sweden joining NATO? Here we're facing an interesting contradiction in European thinking. On the one hand, Europeans are exulting over the fact that the Russian army proved to be so incompetent and broken down that they could not capture cities 30 kilometers from their border. So it's an empty shell. On the other hand, they're saying it's such an enormous danger that we have to defend ourselves against an attack by this army against Western Europe. Doesn't make any sense. Finland and Sweden gain nothing by joining NATO, except giving the United States the gift that it wants of dominating Europe. There has been no threat to any of the Baltic countries. Right through the Cold War, Austria, Finland were neutral, never any threat to them. There's certainly no reason why there should be a threat today when we have just seen that the Russian army is incapable of even, as I said, capturing cities a couple of miles from its border. Notice that all the talk, virtually all the talk, is about how to deal with war. Something's missing. How about the talk about how to deal with peace? How about an effort to spare Ukrainians further tragedy? We all know that a war ends in one of two ways. Either one side destroys the other, or there's a negotiated settlement. What's going to happen here? Now, Russia's not going to be destroyed. It's too powerful to be, may lose the war in Ukraine. It's not going to be destroyed. Ukraine can be destroyed. Russia has the capacity to destroy Ukraine. We know that. In fact, it has the capacity to destroy the world, certainly Ukraine. So one possibility is Ukraine will be destroyed. The other possibility is a negotiated settlement. Well, actually, Zelensky has proposed a variety of steps towards a negotiated settlement. We don't know if Russia will accept them. They've indicated some varying degrees of support. The United States has been strongly opposed. The US position remains officially what it was in the statements of last September and last November. Door open to Ukraine entering NATO, advanced military weapons, joint training, joint exercises. That means no negotiations. China, which could be of assistance in moving towards negotiations, has not done so, staying on the sidelines. We should notice that the Chinese position is, I think, is subject to criticism, but we should remember it's the same as the US position, not participating in negotiations. And it's also pretty much the position of most of the world. The global South has been staying on the sidelines. They deplore the invasion, condemn it, but they say, basically, what's new? You've been doing this to us forever. So what's the fuss about? We condemn it, but we're not going to join you. And that's pretty much the global situation. If you look at, so what should we be talking about? We should be talking about how to save Ukraine from destruction. And that means moving towards negotiations, not hampering them, not staying away from them, but focusing on them and seeing what can be achieved. We don't know. You can have all kinds of speculations about what's in Putin's mind, but we know one thing for certain. If we don't try to enter into diplomacy and negotiations, there won't be any. That's obvious. It's very unlikely that Russia and Ukraine alone can reach a negotiated settlement. It will involve great power participation, as is always the case in negotiations. You look at them, Bosnia, anyone you look at, there's always great power participation. It's the way the world works. So the concentration of our efforts and energy should be on trying to see if we can bring about a diplomatic settlement instead of fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is basically the operative policy. That's not my phrase, incidentally. I'm borrowing it from Ambassador Chas Freeman, one of the most respected figures in the diplomatic service, the person who was in fact involved in trying to create the Partnership for Peace in the early 90s, and one of the many who was bitterly opposed to Clinton's violation of the agreements.
We talked about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Do you believe that buffers, you talked about great power politics, great power competition. Do you believe that buffer zones between great powers are a good thing?
It's better than war, but there's something still better, a European common home in which there are no military alliances. That's what we should be striving for. As far as I know, there's only one European statesman who's sort of moving in that direction. That's Macron. His abortive efforts at negotiations with Russia were small moves towards establishing something like the de Gaulle, Gorbachev vision of a common European home with no military alliances. If the Kremlin had a single person who resembled a statesman, anyone like a statesman, they would have used that opportunity. They would have exploited the opportunity to draw Europe into a common alliance with Russia with no military alliances, either side, none. Many advantages for Europe. Trade relations are obvious. Security reasons are obvious. Kremlin could have pursued that option. Would it have? Macron sort of gave an opening. Would it have worked? You never know unless you try. He refused to try. Instead, reach for the gun. That's the normal way that powerful figures act. So let's invade, let's hand Europe over to the United States on a silver platter, to destroy the possibilities for peace. That's unfortunately the choice that was made. As I say, if there had been anyone with the vision of someone like Gorbachev, might have been different.
To what extent do you believe that the United States and Russia are already at war with one another through the war in Ukraine?
They are indirectly at war. The United States, Russia invaded Ukraine. It's now apparently massing forces for what looks like a major attack in the Donbass region along the border. So they're obviously at war. The United States is, well, I mentioned its official stand. This is before the invasion, but it remains so. It's indirectly at war. Both sides know that if this war turns into an actual war, we're all finished. It's the end. Can't have a nuclear war between the major powers. Inconceivable. It destroys everything. So that's where we stand. Incidentally, it's not only nuclear war. Putin gave a huge gift to the fossil fuel industry. It means they're exulting, they're euphoric. They're free from pressures from environmentalists. They're not being criticized. They're being praised for increasing fossil fuel production, helping to ensure that the climate will be destroyed and organized human life will not be able to persist. They're being lauded for that as saving civilization from Putin. It's very hard to surpass the euphoria in the offices of the main weapons producers, Lockheed Martin, and the fossil fuel producers. They've just given a go ahead and destroy the world as quick as you can. They love it. That's one of Putin's contributions.
How do you, when you look at the war in Ukraine, how do you assess the risk of nuclear war or World War III?
Nobody can assess the risks. We just know that it's possible, and that's too much of a risk. You have to not only calculate the risk, but consider the consequences. If there's a nuclear war, we're finished. The end of the human experiment. Okay, that's what the risk is. It's not a risk worth taking.
To what extent do you believe that we are in a new Cold War? Because sometimes it is now framed as a sort of competition between systems, between democracy and autocracy. Do you believe that's the case, or do you believe that's wrong?
Well, if you wanted to take a look at the major U.S. allies, the main recipients of U.S. military aid are Israel, apartheid state, democracy for Jews, not for others. Egypt is the second largest recipient, the worst, most brutal dictatorship in Egypt's ugly history. Other leading allies are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the most reactionary, harsh, anti-democratic states in the world. Take a look at the record of the United States, which leads this Western alliance. It's a record of overthrowing parliamentary democracies over and over. Iran, Guatemala, Chile, Brazil, do I have to run through the record? A long history of contempt for parliamentary democracy. Of course, Russia is a highly autocratic state, but worse than the ones that are the main US allies? I mean, how can anybody talk with a straight face about a conflict between democracy and autocracy? It's not even a joke.
What do you think we learn about the Western world and sort of spreading so-called Western values in the world? Do we learn anything when we look towards Ukraine and the war there?
That's why the global South is staying out of this, and in fact, cracking up with ridicule when they hear the West talk about Western values. In Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, you want to talk about Western values? I mean, literally cracking up in ridicule. Amazed that Westerners can even produce these words. They know what Western values are. In fact, they see it right now. It's not in the past. They see Western values in the European reaction to refugees fleeing from centuries of European violence and destruction. I don't have to run through the European record in Africa. Okay. Countries are wrecked, destroyed. People are fleeing in terror. What does Europe do? Let them drown in the Mediterranean, set up bases in Niger to prevent them from getting to the Mediterranean. That's European values. Want to see more of European values? Look at Afghanistan. Millions of people, literally, are facing starvation. Millions. Real starvation. There is food in the markets, but people with a little money have to watch their children starve because of Western values. The United States stole Afghans' funds. $10 billion are stolen, sitting in New York banks, so that Afghan mothers can watch their children starve and not go to the market because they can't get to their bank accounts. That's Western values. Or they can look at, say, Yemen, worst humanitarian crisis in the world, mainly the result of Saudi and Emirati bombing, the blockade, Saudi blockade of the one port, the Hodeida port. How does that happen? Because the US is pouring with the British and some European countries are pouring in weapons, providing training, providing the intelligence without which they can't function. That's European values. Now, we don't have to look at the past. Invasion of Iraq, that's European values. Tearing the country to shreds, the region to shreds, inciting ethnic conflicts that didn't exist. That's European values. If you look at it from outside the European propaganda bubble.
To what extent do you believe that history is cyclical, and what can we learn from thinking about that? Do you think it is cyclical because we sort of are entering into a new, more ballistic phase of history, are we not?
I don't think it's cyclical. I think there are consistent tendencies which show up in one or another way as circumstances change. So since the second, you look back through history, for centuries, Britain and France were the world dominant powers. Hideous, destructive record. It's concealed, but it's barely beginning to open up. So in Britain, which was, you look at British wealth, go back to the 18th century. The richest country in the world was India and China. India had about 25% of world GDP. That's when the British barbarians came in and through the East India Company, then the army, destroyed India, deindustrialized it, stole its higher technology. By the time the British got through, India had 3% of world GDP, thanks to British benevolence and Western values. What about the rest of the world? Apart from destroying and robbing India, Britain gained its wealth by piracy. Sir Francis Drake, other Elizabethan heroes, were pirates, robbing Spanish ships. That's a large part of British wealth. Later, it turned to the most vicious system of slavery in human history, totally different from past systems in the West Indies, finally in the American South. Cotton was the fuel of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Had to have cheap cotton. You got it by vicious, brutal, murderous slavery, ruined Africa by stealing its younger population, and of course, hideous conditions in the Caribbean and then finally the American South. Then Britain turned to the world's largest narco-trafficking operation. Opium was one of the main commodities in world trade in the 19th century, run mainly by the British. Large part of their reason for conquering India was to gain control of the opium trade so that they could force their way into China by gunboats and drugs. Many of the fortunes, the great fortunes in England and the United States come from narco trafficking. One example is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His wealth came from the Delano side of the family, major narco traffickers joining in the British system. Well, that's European values. It was taken over by the United States when the US replaced Britain after the Second World War, and it continued. Don't have to run through the record. It's not cyclic. Similar, you could say the same about Russia. Russia was, you go back to the 15th century, Russia, a little before that, Russia was the Duchy of Muscovy. It expanded and became an empire. Okay. What we called the Soviet Union was an empire expanding from Russia. In fact, much of what was within Russia is also imperial conquests, just as much of what's in the United States is imperial conquest. Look where I'm sitting right now, happens to be Arizona, occupied Mexico. Half of Mexico was stolen by a war of aggression, let alone destroying the Native American populations, just mainly almost exterminated. Well, that's history. Is it cyclic? Takes different forms. Not pretty.
Do you believe that the competition between the United States and China will, as it is often said, define the 21st century?
Well, let's take a look at the competition. It's quite one-sided. There's something called a China threat. What exactly is the China threat? Are they emplacing, has China formed a military alliance with Mexico, where it's inviting Mexico into a Chinese-run military alliance, supplying heavy weapons to Mexico, carrying out joint military operations with Mexico? I haven't heard that. In fact, Mexico is a sovereign country, but cannot do any of these things. The proposal for Ukraine is the same. It should be like Mexico. Sovereign country, no US military, no alliance with a hostile military alliance, no supply of heavy weapons, joint military programs with NATO and so on. In other words, be like Mexico. Well, if we were to look at things from the point of view of the global South, they don't see any difference between the diplomatic proposals for Ukraine and what's normal life. Mexico, for example. The United States is reacting to the so-called China threat by the official policy is encirclement of China, the official policy. Encirclement with what are called sentinel states, Australia, Japan, South Korea, which have to be provided with not only advanced weapons, but under Biden, increased precision-guided missiles aimed at China and circling it. That's one way we deal with the so-called China threat. Now, the other way is, in a way, more interesting. The United States has fallen way behind in infrastructure, in science, technology. It led the world. It's now being undermined from within. Well, one way to deal with that is to build up US science, technology, infrastructure, and so on, because the United States needs it. Can't do that. There is, in fact, a bill in Congress, passed Congress, to do some of these things. It's called the China Competition Act. We can only put resources into improving our society in order to overcome China. This is pathology, deep cultural pathology, something deeply wrong with Western culture that can only see things in these terms. How about moving to cooperate with China on issues on which we must cooperate or we're all finished, like global warming, pandemics, nuclear war, peaceful relations, and so on? Can't consider that. We have to compete with them and make sure that there's no competitor with us in the world, that we dominate the world. Well, that's the way Britain acted too. When the American Revolution took place, King George III, King of England, warned that this would lead to the downfall of the British Empire by erosion. The great statesmen of Europe, Metternich and others, warned that the threat of republicanism, meaning democracy, from the new American state would endanger global order. It would fall apart because of this threat. They had to contain it. Okay. These are themes that run right through history. They're continuous. The United States now uses them. Why, in fact, is China a threat? Why is Cuba a threat? Oh, well, the United States is a very free country, so we know the answer. The United States, unlike other countries, is free enough so that we have access to internal documents. We know, not perfect, of course, but much beyond any other country. So we have documents from the 1960s when Kennedy was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba, and extremely harsh sanctions were imposed, which remain until today, to try to strangle and destroy Cuba. It was a threat. What was the threat? Read the documents. State Department explained the threat of Cuba is Cuba's successful defiance of US policies going back to the 1820s, the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the US intention to dominate the hemisphere. Couldn't implement it at that time. Britain was much too strong, but over time came to be the case. Cuba is defying policies going back to the 1820s and doing it successfully. Intolerable threat. We have to destroy them. Well, that's Cuba. China's a little bigger than Cuba, and China doesn't follow US orders. It's not like Europe. Europe follows US orders. Europe strongly opposes the sanctions against Cuba, the sanctions against Iran, openly, publicly opposes them, completely supports them, lives by them. They're afraid of alienating the United States. Well, China's not like that. They don't get pushed around. They go in their own way. It's a threat that cannot be tolerated. That's why we have to have a China Competition Act when you want to improve US infrastructure. And that's why we have to send a fleet of nuclear submarines to Australia. China has nothing like it in the South China Sea, but we have to be sure to dominate the world. Right now, the US has nuclear Trident submarines, each of which, according to the military, each of which can destroy about 200 cities all over the world. One submarine. Got to get rid of them. They're not powerful enough. We have to replace them by more powerful submarines because we have to make sure that China doesn't carry out successful defiance. Nothing new. Britain acted the same way in a more limited way. So did France. So did Russia in its own area. That's great power politics. Nothing cyclic.
You mentioned pathologies in Western culture, and I was wondering, what do you think are the sort of pros and cons of Western culture? What are the good things and bad things about it?
Well, it's like everything, it's a mixed story. I'll take the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment greatly advanced first of all, our understanding of the world, but also our moral values. Out of the Enlightenment came abolitionism, democratic, popular control of governments, much else. On the other hand, out of the Enlightenment came by far the worst genocide in human history, extermination of most of the population, maybe 80 million people in the Western Hemisphere, hideous slavery, new form of racism which hadn't existed. That's the other side of the Enlightenment. So history is a complicated affair. Take the United States again. I've talked about the negative side. I also mentioned a positive side. It's the only country in the world that I know of which is free enough so that citizens can get some knowledge of what their government is doing. Not too much, but some. You don't want to go too far. So Julian Assange now has been under torture for 6 years, now held in a high security prison, threatened with life sentence in the US prison system, which is terrorism. Why? Because he revealed things information that the government didn't want to reveal about US crimes. The press, meanwhile, I don't know about Denmark, but in Western Europe and the United States is happily using all the information he received, but refusing to support him. Okay, so what are Western values? It's mixed.
I have two more questions. My second to last is, I know that spreading Western values and spreading Western culture, spreading democracy has obviously often been a pretense for starting illegal wars, for starting illegal acts. But do you believe that there is any way of spreading the good in Western culture in the world, and what would that look like?
Sure. That's not going to come from governments. It can come from the populations. If you look at the advances, and they have been very significant, in moral level, in cultural level, and so on, they've come from popular action. Slavery came from popular opposition in England, in the United States, finally leading to a war. In other countries, it was the same. That's how slavery ended in much earlier in Mexico and later in Brazil and so on. How about women's rights? They didn't come from the benevolence of government. They came from feminist movements going back centuries, picking up strongly in the 1960s. So same with everything else. Freedom of speech is one of the greatest American achievements. Came from public action. The Supreme Court made its first strong judgments in support of freedom of speech in the 1960s, in the atmosphere of liberation that was being created by popular activism. And that's the way it works. So yes, we can expand the values that the West professes but doesn't live up to. We can expand those values by popular engagement. We see that happening right now on the most important question that humans have ever faced in their history: how to stop destruction to the environment. It's not coming from governments, it's coming from young people. The Greta Thunberg's Extinction Rebellion, that's where it's coming from. And it's having some effect, not enough. Putin has managed to drive it far back, but that's the way it's happened through history. There's no reason to expect any change.
So how do you think the war in Ukraine can end? How do you think it will end?
Well, there are two possibilities. One is a negotiated settlement. The other is escalation, which will probably lead to the destruction of Ukraine and maybe international war. If you can think of a third possibility, I'll be happy to hear it. Nobody suggested it. And I think that tells us what you should be doing, exerting our efforts to try to see if a diplomatic settlement can be reached. And here we can, if we like to, listen to Ukraine, listen to President Zelensky. What has he proposed? He's proposed neutralization of Ukraine, which is supposed to be Putin's main demand, putting Crimea on the sidelines, off for later negotiation, and working out some arrangement with the Donbass regions through diplomacy. I think we should be supporting that. We're not. We're undermining it. The US explicitly in the policy statements that I cited earlier from just a few months ago. But we should be supporting it. That's what we should be worrying about. That's far more important than figuring out what kind of weapons to send to Ukraine. That's not going to lead to it. The only solution which will save Ukraine from destruction. We can escalate the war to the point where Putin will have his back against the wall, say there's nothing to lose. I'm going to go to war crimes trial. I'm charged with genocide. I might as well go all out. Could get to that. Then Ukraine is finished.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.